What is he supposed to be doing there? Oh, he's got to jump off the box. Okay. Come on. Come on, you'll figure it out. Come on, just get in the box. Just get on the box. Just, oh, there we go. No, just, yep, just, come on. Come on. No, go on the box. Get on the, fuck. If you read a lot about video game design, you'll come away with the impression that there are only two types of tutorials, good and bad. And I'd like to make the case that there are actually a lot of ways to teach players mechanics, and while some are more likely to work well within a game than others, I'd say it's really too context sensitive to make a definitive judgment. So let's try to organize the whole experience of learning in games, to get a whole picture instead of just looking at one game and being like, ooh, they put the thing next to the other thing. Isn't that clever? I'm clever for noticing it, right? Please like and subscribe, please. So what makes a tutorial good? Basically, you want the most players to understand what they need to know to enjoy the game, while interrupting the flow of the game as little as possible, and while trying not to bore the player, including ones who may have already played the game. But those three objectives can also work at cross purposes. So balancing them often means taking different approaches in different contexts. So first, let's talk about the most simple, and the one usually thought of as bad. The stop, explain, and go. The game interrupts itself to give you an instruction. There are lots of variations that can make this better or worse. You can make this voluntary, like the little notes at the beginning of a Dark Souls game, or you can make it mandatory, like the dialogue in Zelda. One saves time for people who already know the information, the other makes sure nobody who needs the information misses it. If you go for the latter though, don't trick players who skip through dialogue into going through it again. What fucking sociopath came up with that owl? Another main way of teaching the player is what I like to call cattle shooting. Basically, put the player in a situation where the only way to advance is to do the action you're trying to teach them to do. For instance, in Half-Life 2, it's pretty important to know you can break wooden stuff with your crowbar. So the instant you get your crowbar, boom, a boarded up door you can only get through by hitting it with your crowbar. Here's a new weapon and whoops, here's a bunch of enemies that you can only kill by using your new weapon. Last but not least, there's suggestion, which has the reputation for being the best. Nothing makes a player feel smart like learning how to play from a tutorial they don't even know is there. Plus, if well done, it won't add any tedium when you play the game again. Suggestion is basically creating a situation in which what you need the player to do in order to learn is also the thing they'll do intuitively. In most first-person shooters, for instance, when you get access to a weapon, it's automatically equipped. And right as you pick it up, an enemy shows up. And because you don't have time to think, you just shoot and boom. Without really forcing you, the game has tricked you into learning how the new gun works. There are tons of ways to make one course of action intuitive. Making something a focal point of the camera, making one place brighter than the others, color contrast, you name it. But the cost of making your observant players feel clever is that you confuse your less observant players. So sometimes, if the information is critical, you might put in a failsafe. Like if a player hovers around an area for too long, you can make it a bit more obvious.
Hey, listen!
And actual last but not least, do nothing. Pretty self-explanatory, but it's important to know what the player can and will learn just from playing the game. And rarely if ever can you tutorialize everything. I mean, sure, press R1 to swing your sword, but how long does it take to swing the sword? What is the range of the swing? How long do I have to wait before doing it again? Oh, what's that? It's different for every damn weapon? Well, which is not to say you don't have to think about how the player will figure this stuff out, but that it becomes more the job of general player feedback, whether in sound design, effect design, game feel, etc. And some games avoid the need to tutorialize by basically keeping the information constantly in your face. Arkham Knight is such a messy kludge of different systems that Rocksteady basically gave up, and a lot of the controls are just left permanently on the screen so you never have to actually memorize them. So when to use each of these methods? Well, first it depends on the type of information you want to give the player. One thing you need to worry about is how abstract the information is. Some things can simply and quickly be communicated to the player verbally. Press X to jump. Done. But some information is too fluid, too symbolic to easily put into words. There's a lot of this in the witness. The rules for a board may be simple enough, but it can be hard to put precisely into words. For instance, in this set of boards, you need the line to divide things up so there's one color on one side and one on the other. Well, not really that. You need to make it so that no square is touching a square of a different color. So the witness uses simple puzzles at first that have so few possible answers that they can be solved without any knowledge, and then a slightly more complicated one, and then a slightly more complicated one until you've internalized the rules of the game without a word being exchanged. But while some information requires sophisticated gauntlets of scenarios to tease out the subtleties, some rules that are hard to communicate in words can be quite easy to communicate by showing someone else doing it, or diagrams, or even if you're antechamber through metaphors. The other thing you need to think about is what type of player you're designing for. For instance, how much experience with video games do you expect your players will have? A lot of games get accused of treating the gamer like a moron, when really they're just assuming you haven't played many other games of that genre. I mean, you can be a brilliant physicist, but if you've never played a shooter before, press A to jump is news to you. So there are situations where you might want to explain the basics, and there are ones where you don't. But it's not just gaming neophytes you need to worry about. Check out this level of Super Meat Boy. The game has already taught you the wall jump, but now it's taking up another level to tell you specifically that you can wall jump multiple times off the same wall. Why would a difficult retro platformer that otherwise isn't that worried about holding your hand stress a little detail like that? Well, think of how many other games with wall jumps prevent you from jumping on the same wall in order to keep you from escaping the room or sequence breaking. Sometimes you need your players to unlearn something they've learned from playing other games. Try to keep track of things that separate your game from other games in its genre. Then there's the question of what your player expects. Does he want action? Well, you want to prioritize keeping it short. If it's a cerebral puzzle game though, you don't have to worry about flow so much, but you do need to worry about the player missing out on certain details. Then there's how many times you expect the player to play the game. A lot of games kill their replayability by assuming the average player will only go through it once, and so they don't worry about whether or not the first 2 hours of the game is unbearable a second time. When people complain about tutorials, this is almost always what they're complaining about. Remember how everyone loved Twilight Princess at first, but then after a year everyone decided it was overrated? Yeah, that's because they picked it up again and got hit square in the face with 2 hours of excruciating boredom. First, you want to divide the information into necessary and peripheral. Necessary information is basically the stuff that A, the player can't even begin to enjoy the game without, and B, the player is unlikely to figure it out on their own. But a game can have most of its rules be peripheral rules, especially if it's a game that gives you many ways to complete a challenge. By not explicating every way you can solve a problem, you give them a chance to discover it on their own without making the game unplayable. Once you identify necessary information, you want to take it and figure out at what point that information becomes necessary. Because generally you want to spool your tutorials out over the first half of the game or so rather than cram it all at the beginning. And of course, some info the player can only act on if they already know another piece of information. Try to think about scenarios you can insert or alter in the game so the player learns through the means I mentioned before. Generally, with the rules that are necessary, you want to use explanation or cattle shooting, or both, and use suggestion or nothing for the peripheral information. You can be a lot more lax about when you tutorialize peripheral information though. You can even teach it randomly by putting it as tips during loading screens or kill screens. Hopefully you can make some use of these guidelines. Look, I made a little chart. And that's all I've got. At the end of the day, none of this theory stuff is a substitute for playtesting, but these issues show up often enough that it might save you some time while you refine your game. Bracket, improvise a joke to end on, end bracket, period. Yeah, I got nothing.